Hey everybody, welcome to the Humans and Wildlife Show. I'm Georgia Auteri, and this is my co-host Christian Zaze. Christian, what are we going to talk about today?
Yeah, something exciting again. We're going right back to eagles, and it's a very interesting topic because in the lower Fraser Valley of British Columbia, that's where we are, we believe that we have about 500 breeding pairs of bald eagles, and in addition, about 35,000 migratory birds. So that is a huge amount of birds. And I remember when I first met David Hancock in 2011, I asked him, we were at the hugest bald eagle gathering in the Fraser Valley. I asked him, that's in Harrison Mills, and I asked him at that time, well, where do they all go? And he said, it's quite simple. They soar up all the way to Alaska. And David, being David, a scientist, of course, wanted to know much more about eagles. So in 2018, he started a very interesting project, which he calls the BETA project, the Bald Eagle Tracking Alliance. That's what it stands for, the BETA project. And that's what we're going to talk about today, because he initiated that together with the Simon Fraser University, and since then has come a long way. The understanding of where bald eagles really fly to, specifically the ones here in the Pacific Northwest, is really been the focus of his life for the last 3 years. So without further ado, let's get David Hancock on board.
Hey David,
Hello.
thanks for joining us.
Yeah.
Hi,
How are
David.
you? Yeah, good to see you.
Yeah. David, it's so nice to have you here again, and we're all in different locations. I just introduced the BETA project as you said. So why would one track bald eagles? What's the reason?
Oh, it's fun. There's a good reason right there, but it's also the source of a great deal of information. I mean, about longevity, about where birds go. If you have some kinds of tracking device or following device, whether it's the silver bands that the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service provides, they're pretty hard to follow. In fact, you don't usually get any or meaningful data until the bird dies and somebody finds the dead bird, takes the band off it, and reports that. Then they get a report back for finding it to say where the bird was banded. So now you know when it was bad and you know where it was found. But that's pretty limited information. The next thing you tend to do is you put color bands on the legs. And those color bands give some degree of easy visible reading with binoculars or telescopes. And sometimes these bands, color ones, have big numbers. You can read them visually with your own eyes, not tiny little numbers. So that
Or with
gives
binoculars, perhaps, right?
Yes, with binoculars. And it gives you much more information back. Then the next thing to do is to put a tracker on the bird. In other words, some kind of communication system that lets it either talk to a satellite or through a telephone system, so you can keep track of where the bird is. Now, I've been brought up when I first started tracking birds way back in the 1960s. We were using UHF and VHS trackers on the birds, but it was pretty limited. It's limited to line of sight. You have to be with a receiver in direct visual contact with that transmitter. And even though I had an airplane at the time, and after I released the birds, I would test that it worked. I could follow the bird going away from me. I never once in months of trying could find a bird on the second or more days. There's just so many trees they could hide behind, or just by chance, or a hill that they've gone over, and I never got any data back. So today, we're using a different tracking system. It's much more sophisticated. There are two, as I mentioned. One is where the bird carries a little transmitter and it sends a message up to a satellite. And that bounces the information back to us to let us know where the bird is at that particular moment. The second system is one that we're all quite familiar with, and that is they carry a cell phone. And their signal goes out and is picked up by the millions of cell towers. Now, of course, as we also know, there aren't cell towers everywhere. So there are times when our bird simply goes out of cell tower range. But the little backpack that it carries tiny little chip the size of your fingernail, it records 10,000 recordings of where that bird has been, even if it hasn't downloaded them to the cell phone and sent them back to us. So we're using cell phone technology. And so if I get on my cell phone, I can call up any of our eagles and we can say, oh, it's a nice, bright, sunny day. Why don't, if you're in range of our cell tower, why don't you send home some kind of tracking signal every 20 minutes? And if we're in a time period when it's very dull and there's not much light to drive the little tiny solar pack on its back, we might say, well, we only want to get a signal every 2 days so that there's enough power left to send the signal. So anyway, it's modern technology that we're using, and we're finding some awesome things. But I should tell you, the very first bird, and I think probably you were with me when we caught the very first bird. I can't remember if you were or not, but I suspect you were, Christian. And we banded it, tracked it, and let it go. The next morning, quickly we were on the computer checking where the bird was, and it was still at the Vancouver landfill. So I quickly drove down there, and it was at the other end of the landfill by the little GPS coordinates. I went down there, and sure enough, there was the bird. In fact, I sent you a photograph of it. It's the bird by itself on the top of a tree.
David, should we try and show a video maybe? So
okay.
I'll try, and hopefully it doesn't. Or Georgia, do you want to launch it? I don't dare touch anything.
Sure. Well, I'm not sure which one you want to. I see there's some images here of what looks like, is this a landfill?
Well,
Yes.
That's the landfill, and that's a still photograph of, this is a lineup of adults. They often go in groups. The adults will cluster together, and there'll be a whole bunch of juveniles over on the other side. And it gives a really interesting perspective of how they're examining the landfill. And of course, the landfill is a garbage dump. That's the nice name for it.
In part, you're learning something about eagle behavior from tracking them. That's potentially very interesting. Yeah.
It's not just learning their behavior, but we're learning where and when they undertake those behaviors and where and when they're traveling. But I wanted to tell you that story of the very first bird that we caught. We put the tracker on it, and the next morning I went out, and sure enough, there it was at the landfill at the other end. And I took a photograph of it, and that was the one. Maybe we just can't find it here. The point of it was, the next day, we went to look where it was, and it was out near where I live on the point at White Rock. And I couldn't find it when I went there because it's a pretty steep and rough place. The next day, it was in Bellingham, Washington, south of us. And the next day, of all things, it was gone. It didn't appear. And we thought, oh my God, this is our first bird. There's $3,000 worth of technology it's carrying. Where is it? Where is it? And has it met bad times? Has the tracker fallen off? Has it quit already? All these things go through your mind. The next day, no bird. The next day, no. And this went on for 30 days. In fact, we'd caught other birds and released them in the meantime. On the 31st day, on that first bird, all of a sudden, it comes back onto line again, appears on our computer with a download of information saying where it had been for the last 30 days. It just happened to not be where there was a cell phone. And so that's when we really learned how this data is definitely stored in a little tiny chip on its back. And then when it does reach a cell tower, it sends us all this information. And so we learned every movement of it during those 30 days.
So I think, David, that's a really important point for people listening, to help them understand how this works. And when do you have to recover an animal to get the data again, and when don't you? We have a bunch of questions from people. I think probably understanding the basics of how the different tracking mechanisms work can be really tricky. So one question David Howden asked about the battery life, how long the battery life. I think you were getting at that when you were talking about it depends, right? Because you can change how often it's collecting data on the location to extend the battery life if you want, correct?
Right. The battery is being used up mainly when it is trying to reach a cell phone tower and phone and dial up that cell phone and then download its information. So if there's very little, the battery pack, the little solar system, that generating system is very small, so it needs some sunlight periodically to charge it. But even if it isn't charging, it can still record data with very minimal amount of data, battery life in its backpack. So it then stores up until it gets up enough energy to, and when it reaches a cell phone tower, pardon me, it downloads it all to us. So it's really a very efficient system. It gets a bit confusing. I see there's a video running in the background.
Yeah, I wasn't sure if this was the eagle at the landfill that you were talking about.
Well, this is one of them. I mean, I've spent a great deal of my time over the last 30 years at the Vancouver landfill.
I feel like there's prettier places you could go. You picked the landfill, though, just because the Eagles are so into it, I guess.
That's exactly right. If the biggest place for eagles is the Harrison River, we can get 10,000 of them in a day, just in a few miles of the river. But when the salmon carcasses aren't there to attract them to the river, the eagles spread out. And of course, nowadays, there's many fewer salmon on all of our rivers than there used to be. So the eagles have had to convert to a new food source. And that new food source has, fortunately for them, been there. And that food source is garbage. And so
I was going to ask, like, what are they eating at the landfill exactly? Because I don't think of eagles as eating, like, trash. Like, are they finding meat that's at the landfill, or?
Yeah, eagles are carnivores, so they have to find meat. They don't eat vegetable matter. And one of the studies that we were doing, it showed that they preferred Chinese over Italian or Greek cooking.
Really?
Yeah,
Someone did that study?
Yeah, I'm just teasing.
Oh, dang it. I was like, I'm very suspicious of that because I think that they would definitely prefer Italian. It seems more like Chinese seems like it would be too seasoned or something for them.
No, the point of it is there has been for the last 100 years an immense amount of food dumped into all the different landfills around. Every community across North America has a garbage dump. And these have become the feeding sources for a lot of different animals. We tend to, many areas, only see crows and gulls at garbage dumps. But here, since we're on the flight path of this huge number, the world's biggest number of bald eagles, we get the eagles that would normally feed on the thousands and thousands of tons of dead salmon. But since we've harvested most of those, they've had to shift to an alternative. And that alternative is usually some kind of garbage. But there's lots of garbage dumps, or were lots of garbage dumps. And this is a really key challenge right now. Many of the garbage dumps are now converting the communities that contribute to the garbage dump are taking all the compostable food from the houses and putting them into little green boxes and separating it from other garbage. And the green box material goes to special plants where they're to companies that are processing that garbage, compostable garbage, into lawns and ground and grasses and so on. So that is now being taken away from the bald eagles. So they lost their salmon, or lots of it. Now they're losing their garbage. And so they all now face another huge, big challenge. But that's another story for another day. We want to talk about where our birds are going and coming from. So just let me briefly set the scene. Christian kind of summarized it to start with, that we have a big breeding population of eagles here. And in fact, I've got 606 this year, totally different active eagle breeding territories in the Lower Fraser Valley. But the big numbers of eagles that most people see are not our breeding eagles at all. They're the eagles that actually breed in the high Canadian tundra and the boreal forest from eastern Canada right across to Alaska. That's the land of lakes. There's millions, literally, of lakes, and they all have fish in them. And that's the
Right.
great
So this is
generator.
part of their migration, right? And so I think one thing some of us are missing maybe is what is the time of year that these eagles are concentrated here? Or is it all the time?
Can I maybe just share the screen so I can show you
Yeah.
the map? Because I think then David will be able to explain this a lot better. 1 second. So I'm just going to see if I can do that.
So the point is, there's all these northern breeding eagles, and they have wonderful food support from all the little lakes where they live. But in the winter time, when their chicks fledge in the late fall, it's nearly winter. And very quickly, after the chicks fledge in August up there, it's beginning to freeze up. And of course, so there's part of the coastal area that we're looking at. That's Western Canada and Southern Vancouver Island and the very southern part. And if he zooms out, you'll see Northern Canada across the top. It's above where he's showing at the moment. That above the area that he's presently showing is where most of the, there in the top part of Canada is where most of the eagles are coming from, and across Alaska and Northern Canada. But they all get forced out of that area in the fall, late fall and winter. And the western half of the continent, the eagles have learned to follow the rivers southward as the land freezes up, because the farther south you come, the later the salmon spawn. So if they come down here in November and December and January, all our salmon are just starting to spawn. So they come down here and pick up all the dead carcasses. And that's what I was referring to before. We get the 5, 10, 15,000 eagles on the Harrison early on, but when those salmon carcasses are either eaten up or washed out of the river because of high rainwater and so on, then the eagles move down through our Fraser Valley and into the landfills, because that's the next biggest source of food.
So they're kind of overwintering in the area. They're like, I don't have to fly. I don't have to fly as far south as I would have had to otherwise, because there's these great landfills here. And before that, dead salmon.
I would have turned that around slightly the other way. They came here for the salmon, and there were salmon down into Washington State, a few into Oregon, and fewer into California. But those populations have long gone or been diminished even before our salmon were. So we were really at the southern edge of this northern migration. Southern British Columbia and the northwestern part of Washington State is where the big wintering area for bald eagles. And as Christian suggested, we believe we get somewhere between 35 and 50,000 eagles coming through our Fraser Valley every winter on this wintering migration. So we have a lot of eagles coming here, but we assumed they had to go north. I mean, I've been trapping and following eagles since the 1950s. So I've been following them a long time. And early on, there were very few eagles in the United States. They had been largely killed off. And in Washington State, right beside us here, they'd pretty well all been killed off in the 50s and 60s because they offered a bounty on the eagles. They paid people $2 for every pair of eagle legs. They actually paid the money in Alaska, but most of the Alaska fishermen who were getting this bounty lived in Washington State. They wintered here. And so every day they'd go out, look at their boat, and they would shoot every eagle around because they could get $2 for every pair of legs. And if you could fill a bucket.
Right. Yeah. I mean, for those who are interested, I just want to interject real quick. David did a whole episode with me and Christian on this bounty on the eagles, where we talked for, in a whole hour about this period of the bounty for eagle talons and what consequences those had for the eagles. David, we have several questions about if these trackers can tell us about what altitude the eagles are migrating at. And so I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about that. Like, do we know what altitudes they're flying at in addition to just where they're going, or do we get that information from other sources besides the tracker?
That's a difficult question to answer. We've had over the years some degree of knowledge on altitude of eagles from observations by people up in the mountains, seeing them flying over, by people in airplanes. I think there was one record of an airplane hitting a bald eagle at 17,000 feet. Pardon me. So they can fly pretty high. The key about eagles flying and their migration is a little bit simpler. We are in that part of North America where the air mass is always moving from the Pacific across into British Columbia and then going eastward to Alberta and Saskatchewan and so on. As the air moves in from the Pacific, it has to climb up over a 5,000-foot mountain range, whether you're talking about from California to Alaska. There's a 5,000-foot mountain range, at least all the way along. So all the air has to rise up. And these birds, these eagles with these huge wings, have this incredible ability. Once they put those great wings out, that general slightly slowly moving air mass is always rising when it gets close to the mountains. And as it goes up, those eagles just put those great wings out and up they go. All they do is set a glide, a downhill glide for Alaska. And that wind is lifting them up the hill. And if they come to a valley in the middle, they just glide across it and get to the next place where there's an updraft. And they can move very, very quickly. And I'll tell you a couple of the stories about this.
Well, can I say, real quick, one really interesting fact that I think is cool about this is that because eagles and other predatory raptors basically have to migrate during the day so that they can take advantage of these warm air currents, a lot of smaller birds actually migrate at nighttime to avoid like flying out in the open and being vulnerable at the same time as all these eagles and raptors. So I think that's something a lot of people don't realize. And I think that that's a reason you might hear people talking about keeping the lights in buildings, like office buildings, off at night during migration seasons. That way you're not confusing the birds that are suddenly out at night, which is already confusing enough for them. And then there's all these like buildings with lights on. But anyways, yeah, so the eagles, tell us more, David, about this interesting story of these eagles using these this sort of like drifting method to migrate.
So here's an example. One of the birds that was banded right just down here by my house, it's in the Surrey Reserve. I think we probably talked about this reserve that we had created here. And last year, one of the chicks two chicks fledged from the nest, and one of them hit a power line. It wasn't hurt, thank goodness, but it went to the ground and it was picked up quickly. And after a week, we realized there's nothing wrong with the bird. So we put a tracker on it and took it back to where the nest site was, a little park. And we let it go. The bird stayed around its nesting territory for 2 days, 3 days, and then it headed north all on its own. And in 2 days, that bird went from the BC, Washington State, US border, right here where we released it, it went all the way to Alaska in 2 days.
Is that Loki? Is that Loki you're talking about?
Yes, this is Loki.
So that is the one that's born on the 6th of April 2020, right? So we know the date exactly of that bird,
yes.
Right?
Yes.
Okay.
That's when he fledged. Yes. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of marvelous. We know that, in fact, since then, we've tracked several more this year. Several of them have done exactly the same thing. They've taken 2 days to get to northern BC or Alaska. It's quite amazing. And they couldn't get there by flying, pumping their wings. That's not what they're doing at all. They're just gliding downhill. And these are birds that have only been flying for 10 days. They've only left the nest 10 days earlier. So it's not as though these are well-seasoned flyers. They're novices, but innately, instinctively, they know, put those great wings out and up you go on the rising air. And so they just set their wings and glide downhill. And so it's pretty a downhill ride.
Are they learning, like, do they cue from adults or more experienced migrators? Like, they see this different type of flight behavior and they're like, that's what I got to do for long distance flight? Or do you think they just know instinctively?
I think they know instinctively because they are abandoned. Most cases, the parents abandon them 3 or 4 days before the chicks then give up waiting around their nesting territory, waiting for more food. And then they also depart on their migration. And we know from both history and now from our tracking, these birds do not, when they leave here, head south or east. They go north. And so that's a kind of an instinctive movement. And you can say, well, we're certain the parents have already left because we know that. So they're not following their parents, but there is a general and gradual movement of lots of birds going north. And they are probably being able to see other eagles, juveniles, adults, also going north. So they're following them. And so much of what eagles do is observe what other eagles are doing or other birds are doing, because they give an indication. If birds are accumulating somewhere quickly, that's an indication there's a food source. If all your fellow eagles are setting their wings and you see them over here and over there, and they're all gliding in the same direction, that's a reinforcement of, hey, that may be a pretty good direction to go to. There's probably food there. And that's, of course, what the answer is. The north feeds all these southern eagles. Soon as our eagles get to the north, they find that the banquet is already set. All the salmon in the northern rivers are already starting to die by mid-June and July. When our birds get there, the rivers are already all lined with dead fish. So it's a big feast waiting for them. They don't have to catch anything. And that's the secret about bald eagles. They don't hunt for 6 months of the year, and young birds may not hunt for 2 or 3 years. So they're not that they're lazy, but they're predominantly scavengers. And
David, I just have to intervene with a quick question, a very interesting question here from Kat Gold. And thanks for always being here so active, Kat. Very kind of you. I wonder why they aren't full of eagles here in the Niagara River in the summer. We have them full of fish. She says, we see a lot of fish, but never seen an eagle there. Do you have an idea about that?
Well, now you're talking about something else.
Yes, it is something else.
Summer.
It is.
So you're now talking about summer. In summer, all the adult birds have already, in the early spring or even in the middle of winter, made a determination where they're going to have their nest. So by summer, they're well into their nesting season. And if at the early time of the year when they're deciding to say where they're going to nest, like our birds set up their territories in October, they don't lay their eggs till February, but they've already been building their nest in October and November. They have made the determination that they're going to nest at that site. And it turns out in the summer, the birds from Ontario and so on don't actually, the ones that are there are going to nest there, but there's not very many in Ontario. Ontario happens to be one of the lower areas of eagles. They're coming back. We don't really know historically whether they had huge numbers, but the bottom line is if your historical tendency was to nest way farther north, you're going to be following that pattern, and you're going to, by the time you get to the summer, you've already got your young. Maybe you're up in the Northwest Territories already and having your babies. You're not now in the summer going to head back down unless you were a non-breeding bird. You're not going to head back down to Niagara. So maybe there were no historically nesting birds along the Niagara, or fewer. There are certainly some all along the Great Lakes, but not quite as many as in some areas. But they're building up. They are building up, and there'll be more and more as time goes on.
David,
but it's determined by.
You want to say something, Georgia? Go ahead, please.
Yeah. So speaking of all these water bodies like the Great Lakes and Niagara, we had another interesting question from James Bourne about whether any eagles migrate over the water or over oceans. And maybe you were going to mention this, Christian. I don't know. But
no, that's okay. Go ahead.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting because I know, and you were also talking about, the ability or capacity for younger eagles to migrate. I know that a lot of smaller birds and bats, they will sometimes fly longer routes to avoid crossing over open water, because it's kind of dangerous to fly over open water because you don't have anywhere to land. So like, for example, in the Great Lakes, sometimes they'll take a longer route to like follow the coast rather than just take a shortcut across the water. And sometimes, at least in bats, I think there's one species of bats where they did a study with the radio tracking transmitters, and they found that the young bats, the juveniles, were more likely to take the longer but safer route around Lake Erie. And the adult bats, or ones that had more fat on them, would just, since they were, I don't know, more robust, they would just be like, whatever, we're just going straight across the water because we know we can make it and we know we don't need to stop and rest. So yeah, maybe do you have any information on these smaller scale movements that eagles do? And they don't migrate over oceans, correct?
No. And you just have to put a bit of a thought to this, a different thought. The small migratory birds that you're thinking of, that are particularly those that are flying at night, but the many small birds also fly during the day, but they're flying migrants. They pump their way as they go northward. Eagles do not fly northward. They glide northward. And so what they are doing is going up and gliding down. They will, on occasion, if they're down low before they pick up good height, they may be pumping for a few minutes going in a northerly direction. But that's not how they're going the 1,000 miles. They're going by drifting downhill. The little birds are all pumping their wings. Every flight is a wing pump. And many other bigger birds do the same. The cranes largely do the same. When you watch the big flights and V's of cranes flying, or ducks, geese, and swans, all of which were V'ing, spread out in a V. They're doing that because if you're pumping and flying your way, you want to take advantage of that little saving, 7, 8, 12% of energy that you get by being in a V. So birds that fly in V's, you know they're pumping their wings because they're trying to save that 10%. Eagles don't fly in formation because they don't migrate in by flight. They migrate by gliding. So the other thing,
and to get to the question of the ocean crossing.
Yeah, that's what I was just about to say.
Yeah.
And so the birds, when they're flying, obviously are not going to be flying out very far over the water because they can't land out there. They will fly out a mile or two. They'll fly across from the mainland to outer islands, and they can certainly fly for a few miles, or they might go up high enough that they can glide over to that area. But eagles themselves do their migration predominantly by this downhill gliding.
Yeah, and I think another comment on the ocean migration is birds pretty much no animals are really migrating kind of longitudinally usually, because the whole point of migration is usually some sort of compensation for seasonal changes, right? And so the seasonal changes happen like at the latitudes, like it's winter and now we have to go south because it's winter up there. So there's not a lot of point in crossing an ocean like going this way sort of across the planet, because you're just doing a lot of work probably to stay in winter, right? In the same degree of winter, if that.
Unless you happen to be an oceanic seabird whose total life is dependent upon finding a fish out in the open ocean.
Loop migrations, animals of the ocean that are in the ocean, underwater conditions are kind of different. And then there's some like more nomadic migrants that are kind of like, doing more sporadic things. But eagles, we can look in the map, they're kind of more of a north-south, one of those migrants. Where did the map go? Oh, Christian, you were sharing the map before.
Okay, I will do that again, because I think let's, in that sense, put the map on, because it's also a nice transition point for David to actually explain also about the specific migration of some birds. So I'll put it back on 1 second. Okay, you go ahead, George.
So we're looking at central North America there, the red lines going up the side of the screen there are actually migration paths of some of our tracked birds. But that's Western British Columbia that most of that is happening, from southern British Columbia around Vancouver on up the coast toward the coast of Alaska, because Alaska starts right there where our red lines begin. Also, the bottom line is our eagles are here, as I started to say before. We have a nesting population of eagles that are dispersed over a huge area, and when they have raised their young, they want to go north because of the free food that's already dead, lining every river in northern British Columbia and Alaska where there are salmon. And so our birds go north to take advantage of that dead food. The birds on the other side of the northern end of their breeding range, the big population of tundra and boreal forest breeding eagles, they face kind of the same thing, but in reverse. They raise their young late in the season because that's when the lakes thaw out. But barely do they have their young off the nest, then the lakes are starting to freeze again. Well, you can't make a living from hunting fish very well if the lakes are all frozen. So that big, huge population of eagles, probably 100,000 of them, move southward. And that's when we start to get our big wintering numbers. And so they come south. And so our population of breeders, which have gone north briefly, they have to come back as well. But they follow all those rivers south until each one of them freezes up, and then they go farther south and get to the next one. That's why we get this huge concentration ending up on the Harrison River. Number one, it's the biggest spawning river in all of Canada. So naturally, there's more dead fish there. So there's naturally more food for the eagles. So they know this, and they come to take advantage of that. So that directs this movement of the basic pattern of eagle movements. They follow the fish source.
David, can I make a remark? I mean, I haven't studied this map a lot, but there's one thing we always call an outlier. There's always one outlier. I see there's one blue line going all the way almost to the Yukon, right? It's an incredible path, whilst the others are very regular.
Who is that? Who is that?
I can tell you a bit about that.
Tell us, because this is
going to tell you two stories. One of them, that I can't see the map to tell you where this one is.
Shall we put it on, Georgia, can you put it on the whole? So
I can't see the northern part of the range. I mean, I can't see anything on it. It's not big enough. But we had one bird.
Now you should be able to. Goes all the way up to Inuvik?
Yes.
Inuvik, sorry. Yeah.
Okay, I'm not picking up the bird, but I know where it basically went. That was a bird from down here that was nesting down here. Right on the right in lower mainland here. And it's a young bird, and the young birds are probably going more extensively than the adults. They don't quite yet know where to stop. They get into this routine of it's built into them, go north, young man or woman, and they keep going. And some of them, this particular bird, kept going until it hit the Bering Sea. We had another bird last year, a couple of years ago now, that we had a tracker on. We caught it at the Vancouver landfill, and it was a 3-year-old eagle. It's not yet mature, doesn't have a breeding territory, so it's free to go where it wants. That bird went up the Fraser River, up to Prince George, where the Fraser River curves around and goes south again, and it then went eastward across the Rocky Mountains, across Alberta to the east end of Great Slave Lake, right on the edge of the Northwest Territories in northern Alberta. Now, it's quite possible that bird was reliving where it had come from. So it's possible that bird, because just north of there is the biggest breeding area of all for eagles. That's the boreal forest. So it's quite possible that bird was going back to its homeland where it had, hatched out 3 years earlier. And it went a long way from here. I'll divert to another small, interesting study on eagles. That one of the big studies that was done a few years ago now, about 6, 7, when the oil spill happened in the Gulf of Texas, and they killed so many creatures with the oil, they were losing all their pelicans, and there was a big amount of money went into studying pelicans, and 9 satellite trackers were left over from the pelican study, and they were put on 9 bald eagles in a place called Morgan City, Louisiana, right down beside, right at the mouth of the Mississippi River. And all 9 of those birds that were trackers were put on, all of them left there in end of January. And by the end of June, every one of those birds, half of which had been adults with nests there, the other half were young birds, they all crossed the Canadian border. So they
Oops, have we lost David? Yes, we have.
Yeah,
Okay.
we lost David.
Okay.
So all the Eagles immigrated to Canada, basically, when we left off.
Yeah, we could just be listening to the story. I'm just going to jump in very quickly, Georgia, and tell a little bit about this map in the meantime. We can see if he's going to come back online. I just wanted to show this web page because it's quite amazing. Just scrolling down. So this is the web page. I'm just going to put the link again into the chat. 1 second. So this is the project that David's talking about, the Bald Eagle Tracking Alliance. I've given the link. If you scroll down, that's Miles. He's a young biologist who works together with David on a lot of projects. He also lives at the Hancock Wildlife Foundation, and they've done a lot of projects. And here you see a list of all the eagles. It's quite a list since 2018. And each of them are the tracking is updated all the time, and you can follow them. And David was particularly talking about one eagle called Loki, very interesting. And the nest that Loki came from is in the Surrey Reserve. I'll just show that's the nest. And it was actually, I read about this a bit, so I know it was born on the 6th of April, 2020. That's why they know so much about this bird, right? And then it came to Owl, and then David, Owl is the rehab center, because apparently it fell out of the nest, and then it recovered there, and 10 days later, it went on a long trip. So you can follow all these.
Serving a really great purpose here.
Oh, there you are. Okay, I was just going. I was giving your talk, David. So go on, please.
Yeah.
Okay, you're back. You're back.
Go ahead. Go ahead. I would go on and tell you these stories.
No, I'm going to disappear. I was just explaining a little bit about the map, so that we see them and what they mean. I was just going onto your site and explaining the different eagles here, the trackers, right?
Yeah. Yes. Kate Patton says that she loves the tracking maps. So interesting. And yeah, there's another website called MoveBank where they actually consolidate. They're trying to consolidate all these different animal tracking data sets. And so you can scroll through and look at, whales and turtles and eagles. It's pretty cool.
Yeah. Our birds, our eagles are all done through MoveBank, but we take the data from our birds as it comes in. It goes to MoveBank where they can plot it, but then we get the data back again and we plot it onto our website. So if you go to the HancockWildlife.org, you can not only see all our nest cameras in the eagle nest, but you can also go to the drop screen that says tracking, and you can see where each of these eagles goes each day. And some people tend to follow them and check where they are every day. It's kind of interesting.
Ooh, stalking the eagles. We have so many cool videos here. I really want to show one of the videos of someone putting a tracker on an eagle, because I think that those are super cool.
Yeah, well, that one up in the top left.
This one?
Yeah, that's Dr. Sear, Mike Sear. He's now a retired medical doctor, but he's now going to do a doctorate in zoology on eagles, and he's one of the directors of our foundation now. And he helped me build the last 3 eagle nests.
That's kind of It's kind of cool. You can see if you look closely. The
more
little
eagles in
solar
our new
people.
nest this coming year.
Yeah.
But yeah, for some reason my screen has stopped.
It's still playing for me. I think.
Yeah, that's the bird being that we put a tracker on. And in fact, that bird is what we call the Vanier bird. It came from Vanier Park in downtown Vancouver, right in the center of Vancouver. And it's a very productive nest right in a little park there in beside the Granville Street Bridge. And that bird is now one of the ones that's up in Alaska. You saw it being released there. It stayed around the breeding territory for 4 or 5 days. It visited a few people's those towers, apartment towers. It visited a couple of people's apartment complexes there, and then the bird headed to Alaska, and now it's up in Alaska somewhere. I didn't look at it this morning to see where it is. But let's hope it comes back again. I mean, they will generally. Yeah.
I hear music coming from somewhere.
Yeah, sorry. That's our techie guy phoning me about a technical problem on one of our cameras. So
I was trying to mute the video, and then I was like, I don't think it's from the video.
By the way, David, that's the video I made, right?
Yeah, Mahara has taken it away. She's going to talk to Ken.
Anyway, this was done in 2018, this video, right? So
I can't quite see it yet, but he's just adjusting the camera. Yeah, I see. That's the tracker on the back of the bird there now. That's a nice adult. I'm holding that. And Miles, our associate here, Miles is a young biologist, and he does the techie parts of seeing that the trackers are functioning with MoveBank and so on. And he's putting the tracker actually on the bird as I'm holding it there.
So we have a question from Kit. Have trackers ever fallen off? I don't know, but when we put them on bats, they're actually designed to fall off after a certain period of time. That's how we recover some of them. But yeah, what do you do with these trackers?
Well, ours are not designed to fall off, but they obviously will at some point, because it's a kind of a plastic thread that holds it on. So they're probably going to last 3 or 4 years, which is usually as longer than the functionality of the tracker. We're lucky to get 2 and 3 years out of a tracker.
So that tracker is kind of tied around the bird's body with a plastic thread. Is that correct?
Yes, it's about 1/4 of an inch wide. I'm just being given.
Power's out.
Oh.
The NIMO on Broadway.
Yeah, so there's like different ways of attaching the different types of transmitters. You can glue them on to the animal. So with many of the smaller radio trackers for bats, we'll like trim the fur, so it's just their skin, and then we'll use like a safe brand of glue to like glue it on, and it'll fall off after a couple of weeks. But yeah, there's other ways of tying them on, stitching them on, whatever.
Ours is a harness. It goes right around the bird, and we crimp it on the front. So it's on there to stay, unless it frays off or rots. We kept a number of these birds, and people have been putting trackers on eagles now for 30 years. So there's a lot of experience in doing this and how to do it, and it seemed pretty safe. I mean, we would only do it if we felt it was safe. So
yeah. And another thing I want to say is the size of the eagle is part of what permits you to use these cool tracking methods, because we had a question way back about how small of a bird you can put a tracker on. And I know we put them on, quite small bats, but we couldn't put like one of these cell phone trackers on a very small bat. I think the smallest animal I know of that you can put a like GPS tracker on is like 1 ounce. So the fact that the eagles are big has facilitated tracking them with all these different methods. Yeah.
They put a tracker on hummingbirds, but it's very tiny and it has a low life level, and you have to be fairly close to read it. We're just fortunate. This thing can carry not not only its own solar panel to generate power, but it carries this mini computer and disk in it. The whole thing, though, was still only 50 grams, so it's not very heavy. I mean, an eagle is going. Let's see, as a 10 pounds, so that's 4.5 kilos. So sometimes they're another kilo on top of that. So eagle is a pretty big bird and can carry these big trackers, which is quite wonderful for collecting the data. And it's pretty minuscule from their point of view. By the way, that bird is wearing the latest style in hoods, hats. That's a hood that we have on the bird. It protects the bird from seeing, and so that if it does what it doesn't see, it doesn't get disturbed about. So once you catch the bird, you slip the hood over its head. This is an old falconry technique, and the birds will sit all day in their hoods if you want them to, if you're traveling with them, so they're not disturbed by actions and movements around them.
Yeah, it looks scary, but it helps keep the eagle calmer, actually.
Oh, it keeps them
Nice.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Once you put the hood on their head, they just sit calm. That's it. The world has gone away from them, from their point of view, and you can do what you like now, and they're not disturbed at all. They'll just fluff up and relax. Yeah, there's the tracker. And it's a bit loose. You don't want it tight, because the bird, of course, can gain a pound or 2, 3 pounds, maybe 2 pounds in weight during the different stresses of the year, from when salmon is readily available in the fall to when they may be gone through a period of not being able to hunt because of bad weather. They may be not able to get food for 2, 3 weeks sometimes. So they'll drop.
By the way, David, you won't believe it. I have an eagle soaring right in front of my window now, just turning in circles. I just had to mention that. It was so beautiful, just as you were talking. It was amazing.
And you can see that through that
right straight on my line of sight.
Sky
it's amazing.
Yes,
beautiful.
From that
beautiful.
smoky sky. Yeah,
it's not smoky. It's gone now.
I know. I'm just teasing you.
No, it's beautiful.
I'm giving
it
Christian
really
a bad time because, as some of you may know, he hasn't totally abandoned Vancouver, but he got a place up in the Okanagan, and he barely got up there this spring when the fire season started, and there were days when he had to depart his house because the threat of forest fires and the smoke was so thick it wasn't safe to be breathing up there. So
but anyway, it's very nice now. We have a lot of wildlife around, so I just had to quickly mention it because it just was so nice together with the talk, to have a pair of bald eagles just soaring in front of my window. How's that?
Here's a bald eagle I've just caught. You were there that day, and this is some of your photography. And in fact, I caught 2 of them at the same time. There's a juvenile and an adult. And we're just about to wrap them up, get control of them so we can do all the measurement. And here we are now putting the bandages on the head, and we're getting the tracker organized on the back of the bird. It's a time consuming. It takes the better part of an hour, 40 minutes to put a tracker on the bird and make sure it's all properly adjusted.
I'm curious with the weight changes, like you mentioned, their weight changes over year, and that the tracker isn't very heavy compared to the weight of the eagle. Do you?
No, they're not very. They're not very heavy compared to the weight of the eagle. That's right. Yes.
Yeah. Do you take into account? Well, I was going to ask a stupid question. I was going to ask if you take into account the fact that like females are laying eggs, and so sometimes they have even more like dead weight that they're having to carry around. But I guess the females are usually bigger than the males, anyways. So they can probably carry the same size tracker just fine, even with the eggs for a little bit.
That was obviously one of the concerns. Could a nesting eagle would the tracker interfere with copulation? Would it interfere with her ability to hunt? And there seems to be no indication of that. If anything, it might be that it's a better handle for the male standing on her back, something else he can get his claws into to hold on to.
It's kind of like a sexual aid, like a sex furniture or something like that. Yeah.
Well, you'll have to explain about that. I don't know anything about those things. But...
Oh, I don't know either. I take it back. Are these things pretty robust to water? Because James Bourne asked an interesting question. I'm embarrassed to ask this after all this time, but thinking of water migration, can eagles or raptors land on water, and are they buoyant? And then I'm going to add, are the trackers very water resistant?
Okay, well, there's several interesting questions there. Let's talk about the buoyancy of eagles. The eagles are pretty buoyant. I mean, they're like you and I are semi-buoyant. They have hollow bones, and they have every feather is hollow also. So eagles are incredibly buoyant if they are down landing on the water. I mean, it's not something they regularly do. They'll regularly bathe, but they can swim, and they can swim for miles. I have watched them swim 2.5 miles, following them in my boat as they were dragging a fish to shore. And they'd given up trying to carry the fish because it was just too heavy for them. And so they just pulled it, and they do an over the stroke, like a breaststroke. And they can swim for miles that way. So eagles are very mobile in the water, but their feathers tend to get a bit wet. And so after they've been lying in the water for some time, they have to continue swimming because they're beginning to lose the ability to the flight structure of the feathers is diminished as they get softened up, in a sense. And the second part is the bird is probably losing some extra body heat. And so probably there's a limit how many hours they could stay in the water without suffering from hypothermia. But I do know I've seen them swimming for over an hour in the water, and they were still dragging the fish. I've seen them give up after some time and let the fish go, and then just take off again, even though they've been in the water 10, 15, 20 minutes. Then they were still able to take off without the fish. But dragging a big fish into shore is something they're not beyond doing regularly. So that's one part. The other part is, of course, they don't normally go down and land in the water for any particular reason. I mean, they bathe in very shallow water. 6 to 8 inch water is what they normally would bathe in. And as Christian knows, one of our nests where we have cameras, that's called the White Rock Nest, the gentleman there, I said, well, why don't you put an eagle swimming pool in front of your house here so that you could watch them having their bath? And so he did. He built exactly what I suggested. And sure enough, almost every day, the eagles come down and swim in our swimming pool that we built for them. So it's kind of neat. They love bathing. Many of you will have been into salt water, and when you come out, you're kind of sticky. Well, it's the salt. It tends to dry, and then it causes things to stick together. Eagles are the same. If they get salt water, if they're splashed from the ocean, or if they're down on the beach fishing, they either want to get a bath or stand out in the rain and get the salt water washed off them. So they regularly bathe, and the pair that we're speaking of, they like to bathe almost every day at the swimming pool that we built for them. So it's kind of neat. Was there another aspect of water?
I was also asking about just if the trackers that you put on them, they must be like sort of waterproof at least, right?
Yes. Yeah, they are. I mean, the bird from the top down of our coastline is pretty damp. Parts of this Alaska, British Columbia coast is in the 200-inch rain belt per year. So if you're in that heavy rain belt, you're wearing anything, feathers included, they're going to be constantly drenched in water. So we had to have trackers, and all the trackers are completely waterproof. They're all sealed within a unit. So the trackers themselves do not suffer from all the rain, or even if the bird was down swimming in the water.
Well, David, maybe it would also be an opportunity to talk a little bit about the costs of a tracker, because they are hugely expensive, the running costs, the initial costs, and so on, right?
Yeah, this is the limiting factor right now. We'd have a lot more birds. I mean, a couple of years ago there, I spent a bit of time, and I think you were with me much of it, and I caught 27 eagles in a very short period. But I couldn't afford to put 27 trackers on because the trackers cost about $3,000. The trackers themselves were just over $2,500. But then you have $300 per year for the phone connection. Just like if you have a small team of daughters, you have to, each one of them has to have a cell phone. Well, that's about $300 a year, or perhaps a little more or less, depending on how much they talk. But our cell phones cost us about $300 per year to keep them going. So, and then of course you have to go out and trap the birds, and how many times you go out and set the bait and try to get them and so on. My goodness, the amount of driving. And we have about $180 a month freezer bill, where we have a commercial freezer at the moment has got about 1.5 tons of salmon in it. So all these things add up, and so $3,000 probably doesn't cover the actual cost of an annual of a tracker. So the foundation, which is totally dependent upon donations, it always appreciates people putting their name, making a donation, and saying, we'll contribute this to following a bird. We'll put on the website, or we'll put your name below as a sponsor of one of the cameras. Because the cameras are about the same expense. They cost about $3,000 installed per year as well. And every nest has at least 2 cameras. So none of these educational outreach activities come without great cost. So I appreciate you mentioning it. If anybody wants to make a donation to the Hancock Wildlife Foundation, they could just go to hancockwildlife.org.
David, I put the link already in the chat. So
yeah, good on you.
So I know that David is incredible, how much energy he puts into there. So as you say, I mean, the running cost probably per year per bird is between $4,000 and $5,000. You multiply that by how many birds now? How many do you have actually? So,
well, I mean, we've just put trackers on about 15 birds, 16 birds, but we're hoping to do a bunch more this fall. I just had a donation of $6,000, so we just ordered 2 more trackers. So every time we get a donation, we order more trackers. But then there's more things than just putting trackers on birds. There's another thing that we've just been going through as of today. This is the last day I can do it. We've been building bald eagle nests, as you know. And one of the great challenges in our area, where we've got so many eagles, but what we don't have are so many big trees left. People have cut the big trees down. And so we often have to go out and modify a tree to make the nest stable in that tree. Or, and this is even more expensive, we put in a big telephone pole and build a nest on the top of the pole. And that's what we've been doing. We just did 3 of those in the last little bit here. And we built a couple of nests in existing trees. That's much cheaper, but it still costs a few $1,000s. By the time you organize it, you have to spend time studying each nesting area to find out, can you move this nest or put one in a tree where you're talking about, that it isn't in conflict with another pair of nesting eagles? Because there's no point in building a nest if it's going to cause more disruption to another pair than it's going to offer benefits to a new pair. So it takes time to go and study what the eagles' behaviors are in any one area to know what you can do to help modify very positively their habitat.
Yeah, you want to know what the limiting factor is in the area for the eagles.
Well, in most cases, the limiting factor here is the availability of nest trees. Mm-hmm. There would be a lot more nesting eagles if there was a proper, and I say proper, distribution of nest trees. Proper meaning they're 500 meters or so apart, mm-hmm. Because they don't want to be too close together. Otherwise, they're going to spend most of their energies fighting. So
David, are you building like basically big platforms on a pole that the eagles can then build a nest on, or are you building like a full-on nest somewhere and a fake tree?
Well, I do mainly build a full-on nest for them because it's easier to do that for us. Once I'm now 83, so I only go up a tree and build the nest if I can get up there in a lift or a crane. The last one we did last week was actually from a crane, where the crane was 140 feet and we were dangling from the bucket, and we got the nest built that way.
Okay.
Usually it's a lift.
So these are on trees that are already existing a lot of the time?
Those are on existing trees, correct. And then we go up and we can find a branch structure where there's a good branch. And then if necessary, we can put big solid cedar boughs that will stretch across areas that the eagles could not put their natural branches that they could lift. We can put a big heavy branch and make a foundation. And then we build up that foundation to being eventually a 5-6 foot circle. And we build it up enough that it's usually 8, 10, 15, 12 inches high. And we even go to giving it a lining of, other than the outer branches are all cedar, we then put cottonwoods on the inside of the thing. And usually we end up in the end throwing a few fresh twigs on, but that's just kind of window
who
dressing.
uses these nests mainly? Like, is it the younger eagles that are like, oh, a new house to move into, that don't have their other nests already established, or?
Yeah, good question. Most of the work that we've done, the first work I did on building nests was we saw nests in natural trees that were repeatedly falling down. I mean, the tree was inadequate to hold a nest. It needed more supports. And so I went up and we built some extra supports and put big branches in. Then this was so successful, every one we built was occupied. Then it became an accepted principle with the Fish and Wildlife branch that if somebody was going to remove a nest to do a development, build a warehouse, another house or something, and they had to move an eagle's nest, they had to do what was called a mitigation plan. If they're going to take out an active eagle's nest, they had to mitigate that by generally providing a new eagle's nest in that eagle's territory. And then they would call me and say, well, can you find a way of getting that eagle's nest there, that pair, to nest nearby? And in every single case, we have been able to do that. Every single case has been successful. So that's kind of neat and satisfying from my point of view.
Because your nests are just better. They're like, this is pretty
yes, it's pretty straightforward what an eagle wants. And to be honest, we can build it better than they can. I mean, I have the ability to lift a 30-pound branch up the tree. Eagle can only lift a 2-pound branch or a 2.5-pound branch. So, I mean, and I can use a cedar bough that's going to last for 30, 40 years. They're lucky to have a foundational document or branch last 3 or 5 years. And then that one will break and hopefully they got another one to carry on with. So we have the ability to do other, and we also can put in right angle brackets if the tree, is really so inadequate. So building in a nest in an existing tree is something we regularly do. The other thing is, can we build a nest in an area where there are no eagles? And we've tried a couple of 3 of these, and we have also got those now all accepted. Some of these are done, again, in a tree, a natural tree, and we've gone in and built a nest, but we weren't replacing a nest. We were actually a long, long way, usually 700-800 kilometer away from another nest, and this tree just couldn't hold a natural nest, but we could enable it to hold a nest. And we've gone and built, and every one of those that we've built is also occupied. And so then the next challenge was, well, there may be areas where there are no adequate trees at all, even trees that we could modify. So then we put in a pole and we build a nest on top of those. And those are more challenging, but every one we've recently put in is also occupied, but they're much more expensive. I mean, we put one in. Well, we got it all ready, and we just delivered the nest to it last week. We're going to put it in this coming week, and just the pole and the getting it augured, the hole into the ground, but the pole and the augering is about $8,000. So
I can imagine they want like kind of a big pole, and for it to be really high up. Like, how high do you make the nest so that they feel safe and stuff?
We try to get the nest 60, 70 feet off the ground.
Ooh.
So this is a 70-foot pole. 70-foot pole is kind of the limit you can get on a semi-trailer without having front end and back end lead cars and a special articulated trailer where you're starting to spend $2,000 or $3,000 and $4,000 on the trailer to move the bloody pole around. So this becomes another cost, right? And it goes up about $1,000 every couple of feet if you above 70 feet. So you can spend $15,000 on a 90-foot pole, and an extra $3,000 or $4,000 on having it hauled. So it really gets expensive if you go higher.
Plus the crane, right, and so on.
Well, then we have to have then we have to put the nest.
Expensive.
We have to create the nest. That costs us about $5,000 to weld together a nest and have another $3,000 or $4,000 of time going out and getting all the branches. I mean,
where are you getting these branches from? I'm imagining you like hiking around with your chainsaw in the woods.
I don't quite go hiking around. I go to my favorite friends who are arborists, and they're cutting down trees, cedar trees, and I get them to help me, and their crews are having to normally cut the tree branches down and chip them up. I say, well, help me put them into my trailer, and so I've gone and got 3 trailer loads. In fact, I got about 8, but the trailers weren't always full, and we've used that many poles this year building nests. So it takes a lot of time and energy just to collect all these branches. Then you have to get them up and into either the nest structure, which we organize that all on the ground before we put the nest onto the pole, or we have to carry the branches up the tree. And if we can take them up in a lift, that's wonderful. And if we can't get the lift nearby, then we hire climbers. Or we just had one the last 2 days who was very kindly volunteered all this time, and he has to climb the tree, and then he pulls the branches up after him. So it just depends on the circumstance. We have to be adaptable to build the nest in whatever way is necessary to fit that tree and that eagle territory, because as I say, some eagles have run out of trees in their territories. Maybe the one being cut down is the last bloody tree available to them.
We have this image here. I'm not sure if it's related or not. All I see is that it's labeled, let me take me and Christian off. All I see is it's labeled something about a nest in a subdivision.
That's a Surrey reserve nest. Yes, that's
is it? Yes, that's the Surrey. That's a wonderful tree with a wonderful nest in it.
And the nest, to be clear, it looks like of the 2 sort of sparse non-evergreen trees, it's in the one that's on the right, and it's just like that sort of black area in the middle.
Yes, it's right immediately to the right of that tree, but behind it is a conifer. You can see it going up behind it, and that is the nest, and that's our so-called Surrey reserve nest. It has a camera above it. It also has a camera over in that other tree to the left that looks into it. And I mean, if you want a little story. About 15 years ago now, somebody was wanting to make a subdivision there, and the whole area was all trees. And I said, well, I gave a proposal that they make a small section of a roadway, a block of a few apartment blocks that would become an eagle reserve. Well, the builder didn't like that. He thought that was not in his way of putting more money in his bank. So he said, no, he wouldn't do that. And he put my report in his file. 7 or 8 years later, he sold the subdivision to another developer who opened up that file, saw my report, and he phoned me and said, is this still possible? In the meantime, 7 years passed, the entire area around it had become other subdivisions. So now it's even more important to save this little group of trees. and you're looking at what's left of that group of trees. Anyway, this new developer, Dawson and Sawyer is their name, and they did marvelously. They took my suggestion. We made the area into an eagle preserve. The city of Surrey agreed that because they're donating a property that was going to be worth a few millions of dollars to an eagle, that they'd let him build the houses one story higher to gain a little bit more money back. And I liked that because the higher buildings gave more windbreak to the now more exposed trees, because they used to be completely surrounded by other trees. Now they're surrounded more by housing, as you can see. Anyway, we built this nest. We got the agreement through. I even went to council and made a presentation on his behalf. 8 days later, a storm came through and it blew the eagle's nest out of the tree. Nobody saw it because at the time there was a lot more trees all around it. But a month and something later, somebody found another eagle's nest on another property being developed about 150 feet away. And lo and behold, it was our pair. Their nest had blown down. They built a new nest, but that tree was already approved for removal. So we talked that new developer into waiting 2 years. We went back to council, went back to the government, and we said, we'll build this new nest, the replacement nest, back in the reserve. And once we've got it built, then we'll say, okay, then you can cut the other one down. And everybody went along with this. The city went along with it. The two developers got together and said, yes, let's keep the eagles. And the Fish and Wildlife branch said, yes, we'll let you do that, and then cut the eagle's nest down because we know that every time you build one, the eagles like it. Well, it all worked out exactly again. And that eagles, the second day they were back from their migration, they moved into our nest and started to do all the little bits of fine home decorating. And each year since then, they've raised 2 young. And it's that pair's bird that was the one called Loki that did that 2 days after leaving. It was in Alaska, and then it went all the way back down Vancouver Island, went to Washington State, way down southern Washington State, then back up to Alaska again, where it is right now. So that's one of the local nice success stories.
Dave,
We have
a
a bald eagle preserve.
Can I throw in the question, please, here from Terry Green? By the way, I'm sorry, Terry, for some reason, your comments have been blocked for no reason. I know you very well, and you're wonderful supporters. I think that's an error here in the algorithm and HAPS, but I'm going to read it out now. So it says, hi, Dr. Hancock. The DC nest partially collapsed. The pair just returned from the season. Do you advise to leave the nest alone, or can modifications by humans be made now, or do we have to wait until the next season? Thank you.
Yeah, pardon me, Christian. Where is her nest?
The DC nest. That must be Washington.
Is she saying DC for Washington DC or BC?
No. D. It's DC, Washington DC. That's.
Oh, okay. Yes.
Yes.
Okay. Mm-hmm. Well, their nests are not greatly different timing than ours. So the challenge I have had, and this is really a serious problem, going back to the 50s and 60s when I was doing a lot of banding and so on, I realized that the banding itself did not interfere with the nesting, the success of the nesting bird. Any bird I banded, the parents came back and fed the birds and they fledged. But what was apparent in every nest that I went to back then, every nest, the birds the next year did not use that nest. They built a nearby nest because there was lots of trees in those days, in the 50s and 60s. And they would build a new nest in a new tree. They would not use the nest that I climbed into. And way back in the early 60s, I was giving a paper about eagles at our very first, the world's first bald eagle conference. And in fact, it was just up on the lake in north of where you are, Georgia. And the paper was dealing with the success of our nesting success. And a sub part of the paper was about this delayed impact on eagles. And while it didn't seem to affect the eagle population generally, because the eagles simply moved their nest to a new tree, when you start to think about many areas, they don't have new trees. There are not adequate trees as it is. So I became quite worried that the world about to go into a study of eagles, because the bird was just about to be, the purpose of this conference was to define the bird as endangered and get the Endangered Species Act enrolled and enacted. And so I pulled out of this paper, my paper, about how banding, well, it didn't affect the productivity in the year of the banding. It did cause the eagles to change their nest sites. And then the question remains, if there are no other alternative nests, what would the birds do? Would you lose your nest? And of course, we didn't know about that. So I talked to all the guys that were then banding, and many of them agreed that they had already seen some movement of their birds to different nests and so on. Well, I have had that worry all my life. I would only ever go into an eagle's nest and install a camera or band a bird or whatever it is when the eagles are away on migration. I would not go up the tree when the birds could see us. And therefore, there would be no worry about them saying, oh, well, yeah, that nest has been violated. I'm going to build another one. And then you have to figure out, like, can they build another one? Is there another tree for them to build another one in? I mean, these become really important questions. And the real important question is, to the person who owns that land on which is he going to be incredibly upset with me that I've now made his eagles go somewhere else? And of course, I'm not going to be put in the position of.
Oh, it looks like you froze for a minute, David, but Christian, can you hear him? Or?
No, this for some reason the sound is gone.
Yeah.
It's maybe sort of a HAPS limit that comes in that says you.
Yeah, it's too bad. Well, we'll be. Oh, let's see. Maybe we can bring him back here.
Yeah, maybe try and bring him.
Ah, you're back.
Oh, was I gone?
You broke out for a moment, but not too long.
Okay, well,
but we've been going for an hour and a half now, almost.
Oh dear.
I believe.
Okay, well, that's the problem. Yeah. I would tell you stories for a day and a half if you gave me the chance.
I think his internet.
I know. I love it. I've been really enjoying it. That's why I've just been sticking around for, and listening. But we appreciate you so much for sharing all of your stories and experiences with us, and your knowledge about tracking eagles and where they go. Any final takeaways, David, that you want us to have?
Well, yeah, eagles are. Our bald eagle is a recent evolution from old world vultures, the big vultures people see in Africa, the big turkey-like vultures that walk on the ground with turkey-like feet. Their feet of the European vulture is not a grasping, killing foot. But our eagles re-evolved hunting tactics from the old world vulture plan of living. And they learn to hunt with their feet again, but they still retain that part of the old world vulture where they're big into flying and gliding and taking advantage of that.
And scavenging, and
that's what I was going to say. And scavenging. Scavenging is the cue here, is the real meaningful word about our eagles. They only hunt for 6 months of the year. The other 6 months, they basically scavenge. It doesn't mean they don't occasionally chase a bird or a duck or something, but they basically are looking to scavenge half the year and or steal from somebody else who's caught something else. So our eagle is basically a scavenger for 6 months and an active hunter for 6. And those active months of hunting are when they have to fly a short distance from the nest to get enough food to feed their babies. So that's why they're fish eagles, because there's lots of fish over the whole world, and there are fish eagles over most of the world. The only parts of the world that there aren't are really South America. There's no fish eagle in South America, which is interesting. But there are fish eagles over all the rest of the world. I mean, where there are riparian areas, rivers, lakes, oceans, because that's the place that is regularly able to deliver a lot of very small fish. And that's what fish eagles have really specialized to hunt. And it's that specialized hunting technique which makes you both a fish eagle, but makes you successfully able to exploit most of the world. The other half of the year, you can go where you like to take advantage of something that's already dead. In the old days, it would have been the dead buffalo carcasses and so on of the prairies. And also, of course, the huge amounts of spawned out salmon on our coast. And that's a diminishing return at the moment. And so they worked into garbage. Now we're taking the garbage away. And there's a big challenge. And that's a study that I'm working on the side here. And we're going to talk about that at some other time in the future. But eagles have a few big challenges. Number one, they have to have big nests so that they feel that they're secure and up above people. So they need to have big trees left for them to nest in, or somebody to put poles up for them, because we've readily got them to go into subnormal trees by building a nest or putting poles up for them. And the next thing is they've got to have that food supply to sustain their young. And that's got to be meaning that you got to have waterways that are clean and healthy and producing good stocks of fish. Our eagles depend upon productive waterways for fish. And of course, ours also depend upon the dead salmon at the other half of the year to live on, because they live on dead salmon for half the year. So that's my parting shot. Fish eagles are totally dependent upon the waterways and having clean, healthy waterways. And so without them, we're going to have no fish and we're going to have no eagles. So keep your waterways clear.
Well, thank you so much, David, for sharing your experiences again. And just as a reminder to people, you can help David Hancock with the great work that he does by donating to his society. I'm putting the link in the comments. It's the Hancock Wildlife Foundation, I believe. Did I get that right? But
yeah,
thank
Wildlife
you.
Foundation.
Yeah, got it. So the link's in the comments, and the first thing that happens when you click on the link is there's that big donate button, and you can help support building eagle nests and putting trackers on eagles to find out where they go and all the other cool stuff that you do. So thank you, David. And just as we're closing up here, I want to say thank you, everyone, for joining us in the comments, too, and especially to those of you who donated during this episode. We had a lot of donations. So Peter Bittner, David Howden, Kat Gold, Kit Harvey, Kate Patton, and Stanley Skirvin. Thank you all so much for your donations. We really appreciate it. Christian?
And thank you. I just thought
and thank you, amazing. Georgia and Christian.
Yeah,
and hi to Kit. We all know Kit in the background.
Well, we had amazing contributions here from the 138 live chats coming in everywhere. So thank you for all the comments that you've done. You really make this show wonderful. You know, we just are the one side and you're the other side. And next week, I hope this is going to work, but we have Professor David Bird actually going to talk here about drones, drones and how to study wildlife with drones. It's a very interesting and also a bit controversial topic. So I hope we can get him as a guest next week. He's an ex-professor from McGill University in Montreal. So yeah, that's for next week.
Awesome. I'm excited.
Dr. Bird?
Yes, that's the idea. Yes.
Oh, okay. Good. Well, maybe he'll use our data as well.
Cool. Okay. Thank you, everybody.
Okay. Thank you, everyone. Thanks. Bye.